I knew something was wrong the moment the alien queen started avoiding me, because rulers of interstellar empires do not quietly leave rooms just because a maintenance engineer walks in yet. That is exactly what Queen Lyriath of the Aurelian Empire had been doing for the past 3 days, and on a station the size of Liberty Spire that kind of pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Liberty Spire hung above the pale blue curve of Kepler 442c like a steel halo 10 miles wide packed with diplomats, a scientist cargo crews, and enough alien dignitaries to make any security officer nervous. The air always smelled faintly of ozone coolant and recycled coffee, and the low hum of fusion generators never really stopped. I worked in environmental systems, which meant my job was keeping everyone breathing comfortably while the important people argued about treaties. I checked oxygen balance, repaired climate vents, and occasionally crawled through service shafts barely 3 feet wide in zero gravity. Glamorous work it was not, but it kept the station alive, and apparently it also made me the one person in the galaxy Queen Lyriath could not stand. The first time it happened, I thought it was coincidence. I stepped into a diplomatic corridor carrying a toolkit. In the moment she saw me, the queen turned gracefully and walked the other way, her silver cloak drifting behind her like a slow wave of starlight. The second time it happened, she ended a conversation with 3 ambassadors mid-sentence and left before I reached the door. By the third time the guards had started moving her aside before I even finished crossing the hall, which was strange because I had technically saved her life a week earlier, not in any heroic storybook way, just a systems failure. A pressure seal misaligned inside a reactor observation chamber. The alarms started screaming, and before anyone understood what was happening, I had already grabbed the emergency lever and pulled her out before the chamber depressurized completely. Afterward, the royal guards thanked me, the diplomatic council thanked me, even the station commander shook my hand, but the queen herself had only looked at me once, those golden eyes steady and unreadable, before quietly leaving the room. I figured maybe I had embarrassed her, maybe alien royalty did not appreciate being rescued by a human in grease-stained work boots, but tonight something different happened. Tonight the gravity grid in Sector 7 flickered and half the station elevators locked down while I was inside one of them. The car shuddered and stopped about 200 feet above the hangar deck, lights dimming to a dull amber emergency glow, and when the opposite door slid open, someone stepped inside, tall, nearly 7 feet, skin glowing faint blue, like moonlight, through water. Queen Lyriath herself. For the first time in days there was nowhere for her to go. The elevator sealed with a soft metallic click, and for several seconds the only sound was the quiet vibration of the station around us. She stood on the far side of the cabin, perfectly still, hands folded behind her back like a statue carved from living crystal. I cleared my throat, not sure whether to salute, apologize, or pretend I did not exist. And then she finally spoke, her voice soft and steady, yet somehow heavier than the silence between stars. Human Daniel Carter, she said without looking at me, do you know why I have been avoiding you? And something in the way she said it made the air feel suddenly thinner, like the station itself was holding its breath. The elevator lights flickered again as Liberty Spire adjusted its power grid, the low hum of the station vibrating through the metal floor beneath my boots. And for a moment neither of us moved. Queen Lyriath stood across the cabin like a piece of living starlight, her tall frame almost touching the curved ceiling panels, the faint glow of her blue skin reflecting off the brushed steel walls while her silver cloak hung motionless in the artificial gravity. I realized she had asked me a question, and I still had not answered it, mostly because no one in their right mind expects the ruler of an interstellar empire to trap them in a stalled elevator and ask why she has been avoiding them. I cleared my throat and tried to keep my voice steady, which is not easy when a 7-foot alien queen with luminous gold eyes is studying you like you are an unsolved equation. No, Your Majesty, I said carefully. I assumed it was a diplomatic protocol thing, and that was not entirely a lie, because Liberty Spire had about 5,000 protocols for every possible interaction between species, but the corner of her mouth moved just slightly as if the answer amused her. She finally looked directly at me then, and the effect was unsettling. Not frightening exactly, but intense, like standing too close to a window that looks out into deep space. Aurelian eyes do not blink very often, and when they focus on you it feels as though they are measuring more than your words. It is not protocol, she said quietly, and the elevator gave a slow mechanical groan as the emergency systems tried to recalibrate somewhere above us. leaving the two of us suspended roughly 200 feet above the hangar floor. I shifted my weight, aware of the small grease stain on my sleeve and the tool kit hanging from my shoulder, because it suddenly felt absurd that a maintenance engineer with a torque wrench was having a private conversation with someone who commanded fleets that crossed entire star systems. Then I am guessing I offended you somehow, I said, trying for a light tone, which would be impressive since I barely said 2 words to you last week. And for the first time since she entered the elevator, something softer passed across her expression. Lyriath stepped a little closer, not threatening, just enough that the pale glow of her skin lit the control panel between us, and I noticed something strange. Her glow was dimmer than usual, almost like moonlight behind clouds. You did not offend me, Daniel Carter, she said, pronouncing my full name with careful precision as if every syllable mattered. The truth is considerably more inconvenient. And that word inconvenient carried the faintest trace of humor, the kind that appears when someone powerful is admitting a problem they cannot easily solve. The station vibrated again as distant docking clamps released a cargo vessel somewhere outside the hull, and for a moment the elevator cabin shifted half an inch before stabilizing. My instincts as an engineer immediately wanted to pry open the access panel and start fixing things, but the Queen was watching me in a way that made leaving the conversation feel impossible. I folded my arms instead and leaned lightly against the rail behind me, the polished metal cool through the fabric of my jacket. Well, I said, if it helps, I am very good at inconvenient problems. And that earned the faintest hint of a laugh, not loud, just a breath of sound that carried more warmth than I expected from someone whose species was famous for emotional discipline. Lyriath lowered her gaze briefly, as if choosing her words with extreme care. Then she lifted her eyes again, and there was something almost vulnerable in them now, a quality that did not match the stories people told about the Aurelian throne. I avoided you, she said slowly, because proximity to you creates a complication within my species that no queen should ever face. And the elevator lights dimmed to a softer amber, as if the station itself had decided to listen. The words hung in the air of the elevator like a change in gravity, subtle but impossible to ignore, and I realized the Queen had just admitted something far more personal than any diplomatic conversation was supposed to allow on Liberty Spire. I studied her carefully, noticing the way the soft blue glow of her skin pulsed faintly with each breath, almost like a slow heartbeat made of light, and the way her golden eyes were no longer fixed with royal distance, but with something more uncertain. A complication, I repeated quietly, letting the words sit between us while the station hummed around the cabin walls. Outside the reinforced glass panel, the vast interior of the hangar deck stretched below us. 200 feet of open space filled with quiet docking platforms and cargo lights blinking like distant stars. The elevator was still suspended in place, locked by the station's safety grid, which meant neither of us could escape the conversation even if we wanted to. I shifted my tool kit off my shoulder and set it gently on the floor beside me, the metallic click echoing softly in the small space. With respect, Your Majesty, I said. I fix air filters and pressure valves for a living. I am not sure how I could possibly complicate the life of an alien queen. The corner of her mouth curved again, faint but unmistakable, and for the first time since we met I realized that Lyriath was younger than I had assumed. Not young by human standards, perhaps, but there was a certain quiet curiosity in the way she watched me that felt less like the gaze of a ruler and more like someone studying a puzzle they had not expected to encounter. She stepped closer to the control panel, her tall frame reflecting softly in the brushed metal walls, and rested one hand against the railing beside her. Aurelian hands are elegant, long fingers with faint silver patterns running beneath the skin like distant lightning. I had noticed them once before when she accepted a diplomatic tablet from the station commander, but seeing them this close felt strangely more personal than anything else about the encounter. Among my people, she said slowly, emotion is not simply a matter of preference. It is bound to biology, law, and leadership. A queen must remain balanced, untouched by impulses that could cloud judgment across entire star systems. I nodded slowly, beginning to understand that whatever she was about to explain had less to do with politics and more to do with something much older than treaties. The elevator lights dimmed again as the station shifted power to another sector. leaving the cabin washed in a softer amber glow that made the faint blue radiance of her skin stand out even more clearly. Lirith turned her head slightly, finally meeting my eyes without hesitation. "Your species is unusual," she continued, her voice calm, but carrying a tone that suggested she had been thinking about this for days. "Humans act with instinctive compassion even when logic offers no advantage. You risked your life for mine without negotiation, without calculation, and without expectation of reward." I shrugged slightly because from my perspective it had not been anything heroic, just the kind of reaction most people have when someone nearby is in danger. "Most humans would have done the same," I said. "That," she replied softly, "is precisely the problem." The elevator vibrated again as distant machinery restarted somewhere in the station core, but neither of us moved. Lirith took one slow breath, the glow beneath her skin shifting slightly brighter before settling again. And when she spoke next, her voice was quieter than before. "In Aurelian physiology," she said, "there exists a response that occurs when a queen forms an emotional bond with another being. It alters our neural balance and our decision pathways. Among our kind, it is considered sacred and dangerous at the same time." She paused for just a moment, studying my expression as if measuring how much of the truth I could handle. Then she finished the thought in a tone so calm it almost hid the weight of what she was saying. "Since the day you pulled me from that chamber, Daniel Carter, that response has begun." For several seconds I did not say anything, because when the ruler of a star empire calmly explains that your existence is altering her biology, there are not many casual responses that make sense. The elevator cabin felt smaller suddenly, the soft amber emergency lights reflecting off the metal walls, while Liberty Spire continued its endless mechanical breathing around us. I looked at Queen Lirith again, trying to decide if she was joking, but Aurelian expressions do not carry jokes the way humans do, and the steady glow of her blue skin had grown slightly brighter, as if the very subject of the conversation was affecting her in real time. I rested my hands lightly on the railing behind me and let out a slow breath. "You are saying," I began carefully, "that saving your life triggered something in your species that was not supposed to happen." She inclined her head once in a small, deliberate motion that confirmed the statement without hesitation. The elevator gave a faint metallic vibration as the station control systems attempted another remote diagnostic, and somewhere below us a cargo drone drifted slowly across the hangar floor like a silent insect beneath a ceiling of stars. Lirith turned her gaze toward the glass panel for a moment, as if collecting her thoughts, the faint silver patterns beneath her skin shifting softly with the movement of light. "Among my people," she said quietly, "such a response normally forms between two Aurelians during a ritual known as alignment. It creates a powerful emotional bond that stabilizes a queen and strengthens the unity of our civilization. It is carefully guided and traditionally restricted to our own species." She paused briefly, then looked back toward me with an honesty that felt strangely unguarded for someone in her position. "What occurred between us did not follow tradition." I let out a quiet breath through my nose because that was probably the most diplomatic way an alien queen could say this situation had broken every rule in her society. "So that is why you have been avoiding me," I said. She nodded again. "Distance reduces the neural response. When I remain away from you, the imbalance fades slowly." I glanced at the elevator doors, then back at her. "And being trapped in here together probably does the opposite." A faint trace of amusement passed across her features again, a quick flicker of expression that made her seem far less distant than the stories I had heard about the Aurelian throne. "Yes," she said simply. The station lights dimmed another degree as emergency power continued to cycle, and for a moment the only illumination in the cabin came from the gentle blue radiance of her skin. I noticed something then that made the situation feel even stranger. The glow had brightened noticeably since the beginning of the conversation. Lirith seemed to notice my observation and folded her hands calmly in front of her. "The biological response intensifies with proximity," she explained in the same composed tone someone might use to describe weather patterns. I rubbed the back of my neck and let out a quiet laugh that echoed faintly against the metal walls. "Well, that is inconvenient," I said. The queen tilted her head slightly. "That was the word I chose earlier." I met her eyes again, and this time neither of us looked away immediately. There was something undeniably sincere in the way she held my gaze, not dramatic or overwhelming, simply present in a quiet, steady way that made the silence feel different from before. Finally, I cleared my throat. "So let me see if I understand this correctly," I said slowly. "You avoided me for 3 days because if you stayed near me too long, your entire species would interpret that biological response as something serious." Lirith watched me carefully for a moment before answering, and when she finally spoke, her voice was softer than it had been at any point since the elevator stopped. "Yes," she said. "They would call it the beginning of love." The word lingered in the elevator like a quiet echo, simple and ordinary in human language, yet carrying a gravity that felt completely different when spoken by the ruler of an alien civilization. I shifted slightly against the railing, the cool metal pressing through the fabric of my jacket, while the station continued its steady mechanical pulse around us. Somewhere deep within Liberty Spire, a docking alarm chimed once and faded, leaving the cabin wrapped again in soft amber light and the faint blue glow that radiated from Lirith's skin. "Love," I repeated slowly, testing the word as if it had suddenly become a technical term rather than a feeling people wrote songs about. The Queen watched my reaction carefully, her golden eyes calm but alert, as though she had prepared herself for disbelief or laughter or perhaps even fear. Instead, I found myself smiling a little, not because the situation was funny, but because the universe had an odd sense of humor. I was a maintenance engineer who spent most days adjusting oxygen valves and repairing climate regulators, and somehow that routine life had collided with the emotional biology of an interstellar monarch. I rubbed the back of my neck and let out a quiet breath. "That seems like a lot of responsibility for a guy with a wrench," I said. Lirith studied me for a moment longer before the faintest curve returned to her expression. "Human humor is another quality my advisors warned me about," she replied softly. "They said it often appears when you are confronted with something overwhelming." I nodded once because that sounded accurate. The elevator gave another gentle vibration and the control panel flickered, though the doors remained firmly sealed. I glanced at the diagnostic display out of habit and saw the system still recalibrating gravity alignment in several sectors of the station. We were going nowhere for a few more minutes at least. I turned back toward her. "So if your people consider that response sacred and dangerous," I said, "what happens if they discover it involves a human engineer instead of another Aurelian queen?" Lirith did not answer. Immediately, she stepped a little closer to the glass panel that overlooked the hangar, the faint glow beneath her skin reflecting across the transparent surface like pale starlight. When she spoke again, her voice was calm but thoughtful, as if she had been weighing this question long before the elevator malfunctioned. "My advisors would recommend distance," she said. "They would insist that the response be allowed to fade naturally before it alters any decisions that affect the Empire." I folded my arms loosely and leaned back against the railing again. "And what do you recommend?" I asked. She turned her head slightly and met my eyes once more, and this time the quiet honesty in her gaze felt unmistakable. "I recommend curiosity," she said. The answer caught me off guard, and she seemed to notice because her expression softened just a little. "Your species approaches the unknown with remarkable persistence." She continued, "You build ships to explore darkness and ask questions even when the answers might change everything." I shrugged slightly. "That is how engineers solve problems." The Queen took another slow breath and the soft glow beneath her skin brightened just a fraction again. "Then perhaps," she said gently, "this situation is not a problem at all, but a discovery." Before I could respond, the elevator jolted lightly as the station control system finally restored power to the lift motors and the panel above. The door flashed green, signaling that the car was about to move again. For a moment, neither of us stepped away from where we stood, and Lirith's quiet voice filled the small space one last time before the cabin began its slow descent. "Tell me honestly, Daniel Carter," she said, "does the idea frighten you?" The elevator motors hummed softly as the car finally began its slow descent toward the hangar deck. The motion so smooth, it almost felt like gravity itself had decided to shift direction, and Queen Lirith's question lingered in the quiet space between us like the final note of a song that had not quite ended. I watched the floor indicator tick down one level at a time, while the soft amber lights of the cabin reflected across the polished metal walls and the faint blue glow of her skin. illuminated the control panel beside her. She was still watching me, not with royal command, but with calm curiosity, as if my answer mattered more than the machinery carrying us downward through the heart of Liberty Spire. I let out a slow breath and rubbed the back of my neck. Considering the question more seriously than I expected, frightened me. I repeated quietly, tasting the idea the way an engineer studies a new design before deciding whether it is brilliant or impossible. Outside the transparent panel, the hangar deck slowly rose closer beneath us, its massive landing platforms stretching hundreds of feet across the station interior like silent islands of steel. Cargo lights blinked in long, orderly rows, and a transport shuttle drifted across the far side of the bay with the slow grace of something moving through deep water. The elevator continued descending at a steady pace, maybe 5 feet per second, leaving us just enough time for an honest answer before the doors opened. And the moment vanished into normal life again. I folded my arms loosely and looked back at her. "No," I said after a moment. Lyriath did not react immediately, but the soft glow beneath her skin brightened slightly, a subtle pulse that seemed to echo the rhythm of her breathing. I continued before she could misinterpret the answer. "It surprises me," I said, "but it does not frighten me." The Queen tilted her head slightly, studying my expression with the same careful attention she had shown throughout the conversation. "Most beings would find the idea unsettling," she said. "An emotional bond with a monarch of another species carries considerable consequences." I gave a small shrug because from my perspective consequences were simply another type of problem waiting to be understood. "Your Majesty," I said gently. 3 days ago, I was repairing an oxygen filtration unit that smelled like burned plastic and algae. Yesterday, I spent 6 hours crawling through a maintenance tunnel that was exactly 36 inches wide. Compared to that, talking about complicated feelings with an alien queen is honestly the most interesting thing that has happened to me all week. The quiet laugh that escaped her this time carried genuine warmth, and for a brief moment the distance between ruler and engineer seemed to dissolve completely. Lyriath stepped a little closer again, not invading my space but standing near enough that the soft blue light around her formed a faint halo against the cabin walls. "Your perspective is refreshing," she said softly. "Many diplomats attempt to impress me with calculated words, yet you respond with simple honesty." I considered that for a moment and then nodded once. Engineers are not very good at pretending something is more complicated than it actually is. The elevator slowed slightly as it approached the final level, and the hangar floor rose until the massive doors and docking gantries were visible only a few feet below the glass. Lyriath looked out across the wide chamber, and then back toward me, her golden eyes steady. "Then allow me to ask one more honest question before these doors open," she said. The motors beneath the floor shifted tone as the system prepared to stop, and I felt the elevator settle gently into position. The Queen's voice lowered just slightly, quiet enough that the words felt almost private despite the vast station surrounding us. "If curiosity truly guides your species," she said, "would you be willing to discover what this connection means together?" For a moment I did not answer because the elevator had already stopped, and the soft mechanical chime announcing our arrival echoed gently through the cabin. Yet neither of us moved toward the doors. Liberty Spire stretched beyond the glass in quiet layers of steel and light, the enormous hangar deck only a few feet below us now, filled with silent docking platforms and the distant glow of navigation beacons that shimmered like small constellations inside the station's vast interior. "Queen." Lyriath stood close enough that the faint blue radiance of her skin reflected across the polished railing beside me, and her question remained between us with a quiet weight that felt far larger than the small space we occupied. I let out a slow breath and looked at the indicator panel above the door as it blinked patiently, waiting for one of us to step forward. "That is a very large question," I said finally. Lyriath nodded slightly, her golden eyes calm and steady. "Important discoveries usually begin with large questions," she replied. I could not argue with that logic because it sounded exactly like something one of my engineering professors would have said years ago on Earth. I rested my hands lightly on the railing and studied her expression, searching for any hint that this conversation was some kind of diplomatic test or cultural misunderstanding. But the quiet sincerity in her gaze made it clear she meant every word she had spoken. You realize, I said slowly, that if anyone hears about this conversation, they are going to assume I am either the bravest maintenance engineer in the galaxy or the most confused. The corner of her mouth lifted slightly. Which do you believe you are? I considered the question for a second and then smiled. Probably the confused one. The soft laugh that followed carried the same warmth as before, and for a brief moment the distance between us felt even smaller than the few feet of metal floor separating our boots. The elevator. Doors remained closed, held in place by a short delay while the station finished stabilizing the gravity grid, which meant the universe had given us a few more seconds of quiet privacy before the outside world returned. I straightened slightly and met her gaze again. Curiosity is kind of our defining trait, I said. Humans built ships just to see what was beyond the next star. We invented telescopes before we even understood how gravity worked. So yes, the idea of discovering what this connection means does not scare me. Lyriath watched my face carefully as I spoke, and the soft glow beneath her skin brightened just a fraction more as if responding to the answer. But, I added gently, that does not mean I understand what it will change for you. The Queen turned her head slightly toward the enormous hangar bay beyond the glass, and the vast station lights reflected across her eyes like distant suns. Change is already happening, she said quietly. My people will notice eventually that my decisions are shifting in ways they cannot easily explain. I followed her gaze across the hangar where a long diplomatic cruiser floated silently above its docking clamps. That sounds like a lot of pressure for something that started with a broken pressure seal and a maintenance alarm. She looked back at me, and the expression in her eyes held both calm confidence and something gentler beneath it. Sometimes the smallest moments redirect entire histories, she said. The elevator control panel chimed again, and this time the doors began sliding open with a soft hydraulic whisper, revealing the wide expanse of the hangar deck and the distant silhouettes of technicians and cargo drones moving beneath the towering ceiling. Lyriath took one slow step toward the opening, then paused and glanced back at me with a thoughtful expression that carried both courage and curiosity in equal measure. Daniel Carter, she said quietly, would you be willing to walk beside me when this discovery begins? The hangar air felt cooler the moment the elevator doors opened, carrying the faint scent of ionized fuel and polished metal that always drifted through Liberty Spire's docking levels. And for a second neither of us stepped forward even though the wide platform stretched out in front of us like an invitation. Technicians moved in the distance beside a cargo shuttle that hovered 10 feet above its landing clamps, while thin blue guide lights traced slow lines across the floor, but the enormous chamber still felt strangely quiet compared to the conversation that had just filled the elevator cabin. Queen Lyriath stood at the threshold with calm composure, the faint blue glow of her skin reflecting softly across the brushed steel panels beside the doorway. And when she looked back at me, the question she had asked a moment earlier still hung between us. I picked up my tool kit from the floor and stepped forward to stand beside her, the soles of my boots touching the hangar deck with a quiet metallic echo that seemed louder than it should have been. For a maintenance engineer used to crawling through service tunnels, this entire situation still felt surreal. Yet the steady curiosity in her golden eyes made the moment feel less like a diplomatic event and more like the beginning of a conversation neither of us had expected. Walking beside you might confuse a lot of people, I said lightly while glancing across the enormous docking bay. A group of cargo drones drifted slowly along an overhead rail 200 feet above us, their navigation lights blinking in careful rhythm as they carried sealed containers toward a waiting transport cruiser. Lyriath followed my gaze for a moment before answering. Confusion often precedes understanding, she said calmly. We began moving together across the platform at an easy pace, not hurried, not ceremonial. Simply two figures crossing a wide open space beneath the towering ceiling of the station. The faint glow of her presence drew occasional glances from technicians working farther down the deck, but the distance was great enough that no one immediately approached. I rested my tool kit against my shoulder and glanced toward her again. So if we are starting a discovery, I said, does that mean you intend to keep avoiding me less often? The corner of her mouth curved slightly as she walked. Avoidance was a temporary strategy, she replied. Curiosity requires observation. I laughed quietly at that because it sounded suspiciously like a scientific experiment, and for all I knew that was exactly what it was. The polished floor lights passed beneath our steps in slow intervals of white and blue, while the enormous station hummed softly. Around us, a constant mechanical heartbeat that had always felt comforting during long work shifts. Lyriath slowed slightly as we reached the edge of the docking platform, where the open view of the stars became visible through the massive, transparent shield of the hangar barrier. Beyond the station's protective field, the black expanse of space stretched outward in silent brilliance. Distant suns scattered across it like sparks frozen in time. The Queen paused there and looked outward for a moment before speaking again. "Your species calls this curiosity," she said thoughtfully. "Among my people, the closest word would translate as awakening." I considered that while watching the faint reflection of her blue glow shimmer across the transparent barrier. "Awakening sounds a lot more dramatic," I said. She turned slightly toward me, and the quiet light in her eyes carried both composure and something softer beneath it. "For an empire that has followed the same traditions for centuries," she replied gently. "Perhaps it is." A long diplomatic cruiser drifted slowly across the far side of the hangar then, its hull reflecting the station lights like polished silver as it prepared for departure. And for a moment both of us simply watched the silent movement of the ship against the stars. Finally Lyriath spoke again in a tone so calm it almost sounded like a simple observation. "Daniel Carter," she said quietly, "today may become the first step of a story neither of our worlds has told before." The cruiser drifted past the far edge of the hangar like a silent whale crossing a dark ocean, its engines glowing faintly as it aligned with the station's departure corridor. And for a long moment neither of us spoke, because sometimes the quiet between words says more than the words themselves. Liberty's spire hummed steadily around us, the deep vibration of its fusion core traveling through the floor beneath my boots, while docking lights flickered in patient patterns across the vast chamber. I shifted the weight of my toolkit on my shoulder and watched the ship disappear into the narrow band of stars beyond the station's shield. "You know," I said after a moment, "most days the most exciting thing that happens down here is a clogged coolant valve or a drone that forgets where it parked." Lyriath turned her head slightly toward me, and the faint blue glow of her skin reflected across the transparent barrier in soft waves of light. "Your definition of ordinary is refreshing," she said quietly. "Among my advisors, every event carries layers of strategy and consequence." I glanced back at her and smiled a little. "Engineers usually prefer problems that come with instruction manuals." The Queen's eyes followed a maintenance drone that floated past 20 feet above us, its sensors blinking as it scanned the docking clamps below. "And if there is no manual," she asked gently, "how do humans proceed?" I thought about that for a moment while the drone continued on its slow patrol path, and the station lights shimmered across the polished floor beneath our feet. "We experiment," I said finally. "Sometimes we guess. Sometimes we fail. But eventually we figure things out." Lyriath studied my expression with quiet interest, and for a brief second the calm confidence she carried as a ruler softened into something more thoughtful. "That approach is unusual for an empire," she said. "Most civilizations avoid uncertainty." I shrugged lightly. "Humans got used to uncertainty a long time ago." The vast hangar stretched around us in calm mechanical order. But I noticed something then that made the moment feel slightly different from before. 2 Aurelian guards had appeared at the far edge of the docking platform, their tall silhouettes unmistakable even at a distance of nearly 100 yards. They had not approached yet, but they were clearly watching the Queen's position with disciplined attention. Lyriath seemed to notice them as well, because her posture shifted almost imperceptibly, the quiet composure of a monarch returning to the surface. "My attendants have located me," she said calmly. "They are patient, but they will eventually insist on escorting me back to the diplomatic wing." I followed her gaze toward the distant figures and nodded. I figured that might happen once the elevator started moving again. She turned back toward me then, and the soft blue light beneath her skin brightened slightly in the shadow of the hangar barrier. "This discovery we discussed," she said thoughtfully. "It will not remain private for long." I considered that while watching the guards begin their slow walk across the platform, their steps measured and respectful but purposeful. "Nothing on a space station stays private forever," I admitted. Liriath's golden eyes held my gaze steadily for another moment, and there was something almost determined in them now beneath the calm surface. "Then we must decide how to face that moment when it arrives," she said quietly. The guards were perhaps 60 yards away now, their armor reflecting the station lights as they approached with dignified patience. I adjusted the grip on my toolkit and looked back toward the stars beyond the barrier before answering. "Well," I said with a small thoughtful smile, "if this really is the first step of a story neither of our worlds has told before, I guess the next chapter starts the moment someone notices we are standing here together." The guards continued their slow approach across the docking platform, their tall figures moving with quiet precision beneath the high vault of the hangar ceiling. And for the first time since the elevator doors opened, the moment felt less private and more like the beginning of something the entire station might soon notice. Liberty Spire breathed steadily around us, the deep hum of its systems blending with the distant sound of a cargo shuttle aligning with its clamps nearly 300 feet away, while the transparent barrier beside us framed a wide ocean of stars stretching endlessly beyond the station's shield. I watched the approaching figures for a second before glancing back at Queen Liriath, noticing the subtle shift in her posture as the calm composure of a ruler settled over her again, not replacing the earlier warmth but standing beside it like a second layer of quiet strength. "Your attendants look patient," I said lightly. Liriath followed my gaze toward them and inclined her head slightly. "They are trained to wait until I acknowledge them," she replied. The two Aurelians were now perhaps 40 yards away, their polished armor reflecting the hangar lights in slow flashes as they walked with deliberate dignity. I adjusted the strap of my tool kit across my shoulder and leaned casually against the railing beside the barrier, trying not to look like the maintenance engineer who had just spent the last 10 minutes discussing emotional bonds with an alien. "Monarch, so when they arrive," I said thoughtfully, "do you introduce me as the human who fixes air filters or the human who accidentally triggered a royal awakening?" The faintest smile touched her expression again, and the blue glow beneath her skin pulsed softly in response. "I believe," she said calmly, "that explanation may require careful wording." The enormous hangar stretched around us in quiet order, but I could see several technicians farther down the deck beginning to notice the Queen's presence now that her guards were approaching, their heads turning briefly before returning to their tasks with respectful restraint. The station had its own etiquette when royalty visited. Even if most workers tried to pretend they were not paying attention, Liriath rested one hand lightly on the transparent barrier as she looked out toward the stars again, and when she spoke her voice carried the thoughtful calm of someone considering the path ahead. "My advisors will soon request that I return to the diplomatic wing," she said. "There are negotiations scheduled with 3 systems before the end of the station cycle." I nodded because that sounded exactly like the kind of responsibility that came with ruling a civilization spanning multiple star systems. "Busy schedule," I said quietly. She turned back toward me then, and her golden eyes held the same steady curiosity that had filled the elevator moments earlier. "Yet I find my thoughts returning to this conversation instead of those negotiations," she admitted. The guards were now perhaps 20 yards away, slowing slightly as they reached the edge of the platform in silent acknowledgement of her presence. I took a slow breath and glanced once more at the distant stars beyond the station shield before answering. "Curiosity can be distracting like that," I said. Liriath studied me for a moment longer and then inclined her head with quiet resolve. "Then perhaps we should continue this discovery under circumstances less public than a docking platform," she said softly. One of the guards stepped forward just then, stopping several feet away and bowing his head in formal greeting while waiting for the Queen's acknowledgement. Liriath did not look away from me as she spoke her next words in a voice quiet enough that only I could hear them above the hum of the station. "Daniel Carter, will you meet me tomorrow in the observatory ring where the station watches the stars?" The guard's head remained bowed in formal patience while the vast hangar hummed quietly around us. And for a brief moment the entire station seemed to pause between ordinary duty and something far less predictable. Queen Liriath's gaze held mine steadily, as if the simple question she had asked carried more significance than the approaching attendants or the diplomatic schedules waiting for her beyond the platform. The distant glow of cargo lights reflected faintly across the transparent shield, Beside us and the stars beyond Liberty's spire shimmered like scattered sparks across an endless black ocean. I shifted my toolkit slightly against my shoulder and considered the request more carefully than it might have sounded. The observatory ring was not a place maintenance engineers visited often unless a sensor array malfunctioned or one of the station's external viewing panels required recalibration, which meant if I showed up there tomorrow, it would not exactly blend into my usual routine. The guard waiting nearby raised his head slightly, clearly aware that the Queen had not yet acknowledged him, but he remained respectfully silent while Lyriath waited for my answer. I let out a slow breath and glanced once more toward the stars beyond the barrier before looking back at her. The observatory ring is about 3 miles above this deck, I said thoughtfully, and I usually spend my shifts about 3 miles below it inside environmental control shafts, so it might be the nicest meeting location I have had all year. The faint glow beneath her blue skin brightened softly at that response, and the calm warmth that had appeared earlier returned to her expression. "Then you will come," she said quietly. I nodded once because curiosity had already carried this conversation much farther than common sense would have predicted. "Tomorrow," I said. The Queen inclined her head in acknowledgement and finally turned slightly toward the waiting guard, her posture shifting once again into the composed authority of a ruler addressing her escort. The guard straightened immediately and spoke in the measured tone of someone trained to deliver information without interruption. "Your Majesty, the Diplomatic Council requests your presence in the central chamber," he said. Lyriath acknowledged the message with a small gesture before looking back toward me one last time. The vast docking platform stretched around us in quiet order, while technicians moved in the distance pretending not to watch the exchange. "Daniel Carter," she said softly. "Thank you for your honesty today." I shrugged lightly because honesty had seemed easier than pretending this moment was ordinary. "Thank you for the elevator conversation," I replied, the corner of her mouth curved faintly again before she turned and began walking with her attendants across the platform toward the central access corridor, her tall figure moving with calm confidence beneath the towering lights of the hangar. I remained by the barrier for a moment longer watching the stars beyond the station shield while the echo of our conversation replayed quietly in my mind. Somewhere above us, the observatory ring circled Liberty Spire like a silver halo where scientists and travelers gathered to watch distant galaxies drift slowly across the darkness. Tomorrow evening, I would stand there with the Queen of an alien empire and try to understand a discovery neither of us had expected. And for the first time since I arrived on Liberty Spire, I realized that fixing oxygen valves might not be the most important task waiting for me after all. The next station cycle passed more slowly than any shift I could remember, not because the work was difficult, but because my mind kept drifting 3 miles upward to the wide arc of glass and steel known as the observatory ring. Liberty Spire followed its usual rhythm around me as I moved through the environmental maintenance corridors, checking pressure levels and recalibrating airflow systems that fed oxygen to more than 60,000 residents across the station. Yet every familiar sound seemed slightly different now, as if the steady hum of the station carried a quiet reminder that tomorrow evening would not be routine. The maintenance tunnels smelled faintly of coolant and warm circuitry, while the narrow passageways echoed with the low mechanical breathing of the life support pumps, a sound I had heard so often it usually faded into the background of my thoughts. Today it stayed with me because every system I inspected felt connected to the larger place we all shared, a spinning metal world hanging above an unfamiliar planet while distant civilizations debated alliances and discoveries far beyond the scope of a simple engineer. I finished my final inspection panel and sealed the access hatch before glancing at the small digital chronometer on my wrist. The station's central clock showed that nearly 20 hours had passed since the conversation on the docking platform, leaving just enough time for a meal and a shower before the observatory ring rotated into its night viewing cycle. When I finally stepped out of the maintenance corridor and into the main transit lift, the station felt brighter than the service tunnels, filled with travelers, station staff, and visitors moving calmly between sectors while the wide windows revealed glimpses of Kepler 442c turning slowly beneath the station's orbit. A group of scientists passed by discussing atmospheric readings while 2 cargo pilots argued quietly about docking schedules, the everyday Life of Liberty Spire continuing exactly as it had before the elevator malfunction that started everything. I leaned against the lift rail as it began carrying me upward through the station's interior levels, the digital indicator climbing steadily while the hum of the transit motors vibrated through the floor. 3 miles above the hangar deck, the observatory ring formed a perfect circle around the station's outer rim. Its enormous viewing panels, designed so visitors could watch distant star clusters drift across the darkness without the interference of engines or docking traffic. When the lift doors opened, I stepped out into a corridor lined with soft white lighting and polished glass walls that reflected the faint glow of the stars beyond the station shield. The observatory itself stretched ahead in a quiet curve nearly half a mile long, its wide transparent panels revealing the full sweep of space beyond Liberty Spire, while distant suns shimmered like frozen sparks against a velvet sky. A few travelers stood along the railing whispering softly as they watched a nebula drifting across the far horizon, but most of the ring remained calm and open, the perfect place for quiet conversation beneath the endless expanse of the galaxy. I walked slowly along the curved walkway until I reached the center viewing platform, where the station's shield projected the clearest view of the surrounding star fields. And for a moment, I simply stood there watching the distant lights, while the gentle rotation of the station carried new constellations into view. Somewhere in the diplomatic wing of Liberty Spire, the queen of an ancient alien empire was finishing meetings that shaped the future of entire systems. And in a few minutes, she would step into this quiet ring of glass and starlight to continue a conversation that had begun in a stalled elevator. I rested my hands lightly on the railing and looked out across the endless darkness beyond the station shield as the chronometer ticked toward the hour we had agreed to meet, realizing that sometimes the most important discoveries in the universe begin not in laboratories or war rooms but in quiet places where two curious beings simply decide to ask what comes next. The observatory ring remained quiet as the station rotated slowly beneath the stars, and for a long moment the only sound was the soft whisper of Liberty Spire's life support systems moving air through hidden vents behind the polished walls. I stood at the center viewing platform with my hands resting lightly on the railing while the vast black expanse beyond the station shield stretched endlessly outward, filled with distant suns and pale drifting nebulae that looked almost close enough to touch. A few travelers moved quietly along the far curve of the ring, speaking in low voices that faded into the background of the enormous chamber, leaving the center platform almost completely silent except for the steady rhythm of the station's orbit. The chronometer on my wrist ticked forward one more minute, and I wondered briefly if royal schedules had pulled Lyriath away from the meeting she had suggested. But the thought had barely formed when the soft sound of approaching footsteps echoed along the curved walkway behind me. I turned slightly and saw the faint blue glow of her presence before the rest of the observatory noticed it, a gentle light moving across the polished floor like reflected moonlight as she approached without guards or attendants, her silver cloak falling in quiet folds while the distant stars shimmered behind her through the glass. Queen Lyriath slowed as she reached the center platform, and for a moment we simply stood beside one another looking out across the galaxy, two figures framed by an ocean of distant light, while Liberty Spire carried us silently through space. "You chose a remarkable place for curiosity," I said softly. The queen inclined her head and rested one hand lightly on the railing beside mine, her golden eyes reflecting the distant constellations beyond the station shield. "My people believe that important questions should be asked beneath the stars," she replied. The calm warmth in her voice felt different from the formal tone she had used during diplomatic meetings, as if this quiet ring of glass and starlight allowed a different kind of honesty to exist. We watched a distant cluster of pale blue suns drift slowly across the viewing panel, while the station's rotation carried the observatory through another arc of night. After a moment, she turned toward me, and the soft glow beneath her skin brightened just slightly, a quiet reminder of the strange connection she had described the day before. "I spent many hours today speaking about trade routes and political alliances," she said thoughtfully. "Yet none of those conversations remained in my thoughts the way our discussion did." I smiled faintly because the feeling was familiar. "I spent my shift fixing oxygen regulators," I replied, but I kept wondering, What discovery might look like when it begins with curiosity instead of protocol. Lyriath studied my expression for a moment longer before her gaze returned to the endless stars beyond the glass. Among the Aurelians, she said quietly, history remembers the moment when two paths cross and create something neither civilization expected. I considered that while watching the distant glow of a spiral galaxy drift slowly into view, its billions of stars forming a faint silver whirlpool against the dark. The station lights dimmed slightly as the observatory entered its full night viewing cycle, leaving the stars brighter than before and the faint blue glow of Lyriath's presence reflecting softly across the railing between us. She turned toward me once more, and the calm determination in her eyes felt stronger than it had on the docking platform. Daniel Carter, she said gently. Yesterday you asked what might change if our worlds noticed this discovery. I nodded once. I remember. She looked back toward the vast expanse of the galaxy and spoke in a voice so quiet it felt almost like a promise carried on the hum of the station. Perhaps they will learn what the stars already know, she said. That even the largest empires are guided forward by small moments of courage and curiosity. The observatory ring continued its slow, silent rotation around Liberty Spire, while distant suns glowed across the endless dark. And as we stood together watching that ancient light, I realized that the story she spoke of had already begun the moment two very different lives decided to ask the same question beneath the stars.